Hello, welcome to Art Talk. My name is Sonia Bodnar, and today I'm joined by Canadian author from Brantford, Ontario, Marsha Skrypuch, for a conversation about her most recent books, literature in general, and her life as an author. Welcome, Marsha. It's a pleasure for me to talk to you today, as you're a modern, famous author with Ukrainian roots, writing a lot about different pages of Ukrainian history.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I know that as a child you struggled with reading and only read your first book when you were 9. So what's a book that ignited your love for reading as a child?
The book that ignited my reading as a child was Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Before that, being dyslexic, and I'm 68 years old, which means I was a kid in the 1960s. So they didn't know dyslexic, they just knew stupid. And so that's what I was called, a stupid kid. And so they gave me really super simple books, and they were just not engaging. And so I taught myself how to read with Oliver Twist. And the way that I could do it was there were no pictures to give me hints. I couldn't cheat. It was such a long book with, difficult words that I just had to actually learn how to read it. And that book had a profound effect on me because it did take me a year to read. But once I read it, I knew that that was what I wanted to do. Always was to be able to tell stories that would plunge a reader into the life of someone who's more unfortunate than they are, that has to deal with challenges that most of us couldn't even comprehend. And as it turns out now, many of those people happen to be of Ukrainian heritage or nationality. What Ukrainians are going through now is just unimaginable, even, a few years ago. But I also plunge people into other people as well. For example, I've written a number of books from a Vietnamese point of view, others from an Armenian point of view, because there have been times in their histories that they have struggled too. And but it all comes back to Oliver Twist and Charles Dickens when I was 9.
That's really interesting. So if you had those struggles as a kid, how were you choosing books for your children when they were younger?
So I have just one son. He's 38 now. And he actually started to read when he was 2 years old, which freaked me out. It was terrifying, to tell you the truth, because he was so quick compared to me. And it was intimidating. But what I did with him was I let him choose his own books. And something that I believe in strongly is always having a library card, for example, and also browsing bookstores a lot. And so we would do that. And he picked whatever he wanted, and he was reading avidly. So by the time he was in kindergarten, he was already reading novels.
That's really amazing. Is there some specific books you can recommend for each age group to get them into reading? Like one for children, one for teenagers, one for adults?
So it depends on the kid. And no other person can predict what someone will like. And so I think that the key is to be open-minded and let a young person choose for themselves. And what I recommend to people is to browse in a bookstore or in a library and read the first not even the first chapter, just the first few lines of a book. And if it engages you, then continue. If it doesn't, put it down, because it's not the book for you. And it's not because you're stupid, it's because that book wasn't meant for you. And I think that there's too much spoon feeding of people, telling them what they should like instead of letting them find out what they want to like. And so I was a great believer in having an extremely messy room for my son. He could have as many books as he wanted, scattered all over the place. And I tried not to pay too much attention to what he was reading, because it was really up to him. Now, on the other hand, I have to admit, every time a book was banned, I'd go out and buy it, and it would end up on his floor too. Because I think that young people need to be exposed to all different points of view and perspectives, because otherwise, how do they learn how to think?
Yeah, that's right. Is there any book you keep rereading? Maybe like your favorite book?
So my very favorite book of all time is The Magus by John Fowles, Fowles. And he plays around with the whole concept of a novel. And so I like that an awful lot. And I mean, I read it years ago, you know, in the 80s, I think it's the first time I read it. And it is something that I'll pick up time and again. But right now, because I write so frequently, I mean, like generally I have a book out a year and I'm a slow writer. So you can imagine how much time I spend writing and also researching. So the bulk of my reading these days is research. So I read primary documents, archival documents, I interview people, read transcripts. And then, so for pleasure, I read pretty much crap, you know, like commercial thrillers, that kind of thing, just because I need to have a break. I do not read historical fiction. I write historical fiction. And for me, it would be like a workwoman's holiday to read that stuff. And also, I find that I get very frustrated when people don't do good historical research, and I can spot it a mile away. In particular, World War II books, I've read a lot of popular, tried to, you know, as a break, and I end up throwing the book across the room because generally they're just so poorly researched. I think that there's no excuse to write historical fiction without doing the research. And unfortunately, many books geared towards adults, and especially ones called women's fiction, are really historical fantasy. They're not fiction. They're not historical. They're, you know, deplorable, really.
I will also come back to how you do your research a bit later when we talk about your books. And if you had a chance to interview your favorite author, what would you ask them?
Well, why do you write what you write, I guess? Because, you know, you can almost predict, like even if you didn't know the cover of a book, you didn't know the title of a book, who wrote it, and you just started reading inside a book, the voice of the author comes through. And, you know, I would want to know how they developed that and why they were interested in those topics in particular.
And do you have your favorite Ukrainian author, maybe?
So again, I try not to read too much within what I write because I don't want to be influenced by it. So for example, I will never read a novel set in any kind of history that I have written about, because what would happen if I read that and then suddenly I thought that I thought about it and it ended up in my book. So I avoid the things that other people probably would be reading. The people who are reading my books would probably read those, but I just can't. So there's a whole section of books that I can't read, and it includes Ukrainian authors.
Yeah, I see. That's an interesting point of view. And you write a lot about young people and children as well. Lots of authors think it's more difficult to write for kids than for adults. Do you agree with this statement?
It depends on who you are and who your voice is, what your voice is. And I'm basically a 12-year-old inside. So if I tried to write a book for adults, it would still sound like a 12-year-old trying to write a book for adults. And also I find that the things that adults are interested in aren't all that interesting to me. So a lot of adult literature, you know, it's a lawyer who stole money and is trying to get away with it, or, you know, some trivial thing like that. Whereas young people are really interested in how can they make the world better? How can they improve themselves? How can they understand their best friend better? And so those are things that I find intensely interesting. And so half of my readership is adult, actually, but I'm writing for young people. And I think that I have that readership because there are people who are old like me who find that a lot of what's out there geared towards them doesn't really appeal to them either. So I didn't know that I was writing for young people until my first literary agent told me. And I was actually surprised because I hadn't really read books for young people when I was a kid, because I started off with novels.
That's a really interesting fact. And you already mentioned that as a reader and as a writer, you prefer different genres. Is there a genre you would still like to try writing in?
So I would like to write a thriller. And I keep on starting one and then setting it aside just because I have, my publisher asks for another book. And so, I'm writing literature for young people, and they're voracious, which is a nice problem to have as a writer, that you have, your publisher wanting more books. But what it means is there are a lot of things that I just haven't been able to pursue that I've got, half of a manuscript written for. I also have written half of a manuscript about Roxolana. And I really want to get back to that book too. And I've been researching that book for over 20 years. But again, it keeps on getting put back on the shelf because right now there's an urgent need for 20th century and 21st century war literature, so that young people can decode what's going on right now.
I see. And I was always interested as a reader. How long does it take from the moment you have an idea of a book till the moment readers can purchase it?
So almost every single book that I've written was thought of maybe 40, 50 years ago. So I don't even want to count that, because it's sort of like this slow growing seed, and they each have a room in my head somewhere. But when I finally decide that I'm going to start one, and if I have a deadline, then it takes 6 months for me to write the first draft. It takes about a year to work with the publisher in terms of the all the stuff that a publisher does, because there's their edits, but there's also all the marketing stuff and everything else. So usually about a year and a half from when you start writing the first paragraph to when you would see it in a store. And keep that in mind, because I usually have a book out a year. So if it takes a year and a half, like, you can imagine how freaked out I am half the time.
And you mentioned that you got lots of your ideas of your books a long time ago. So how did you get ideas for your books? And have you ever had a situation when in the process of writing, your idea changed and the book came out completely different from what you initially imagined?
They always change, because for me, what I first think of in terms of a book is what would happen if, and it's usually a person plunged into a certain situation. And so at that point, I haven't really done the research. I may have met a person who had similar circumstances, and that's what starts me down that route. The reason that I had a lot of these ideas 40 or 50 years ago was even when I was a kid reading, and then when I was a teenager, things that were in the news, and particularly about Ukrainians. When I was a teenager and in my 20s, there was an awful lot of hate directed at Ukrainians, and there's a lot of stereotypes and prejudice directed towards Ukrainians. And it was all, due to the, impending fall of the Soviet Union and trying to stereotype who Ukrainians were as bad people, right? And so that had a profound effect on me. And then me trying to find books that were written by Ukrainians, me as someone who was raised English, because my father is Ukrainian, my mother is not. She was of Irish heritage. My dad left when I was 9. And so I didn't have any contact really with the Ukrainian community, and I don't speak Ukrainian. And so for me to find something about my own heritage was a quest I've been on for a long time. And every time that I encountered a Ukrainian in a book, they would be a bad person if they were there at all. And so a lot of my books were inspired by trying to discover who Ukrainians really are. And in the meantime, discovering such heroism. And that's basically my motivation for writing. And it's the same thing when I write about Vietnamese refugees from the Vietnam War. It's the same reason why I've written so many books about Armenians who escaped from the Armenian genocide. It's that spark of life, that just this beautiful person that has been treated so horribly and also misrepresented. And so that's why, you know, and I think it also came right back down to me being that 9-year-old with dyslexia that was labeled as stupid, and I wasn't. So, you know, in some ways, I keep on writing about myself because I don't want people to think that what they're seeing and what they think that they can tell about a person is the truth, that we really need to get inside. And so I try to get inside of as many people as I can and write about them.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, you didn't have all the information about Ukraine and your Ukrainian heritage, but you do write a lot about Ukrainian events. So as you already mentioned, you also study lots of archives. Do you also talk to people who lived through those historic events? And
Oh,
what
absolutely.
do you use?
Yes, so that's a primary way of doing the research. So I have an undergrad in English literature, and I went back to school and got my master's degree in library science, particularly to learn how to do proper research. And also because I felt I had such a responsibility because there wasn't general fiction about Ukrainian history. So if I was going to tackle this, I needed to know how to go about it and how also to be able to spot disinformation, because especially for Ukrainian history, there's so much old Soviet disinformation that has been peppered through archives, right? So how do you separate the two? But speaking to survivors of various 20th century historical events is usually a starting point for me. And so once I have done an interview with a person and another person and another person, as many as I can find, then a supplementary way is to read interviews, to read like newspaper accounts are like, that's tertiary, right? They can be changed. It's not, you know, it's someone else's interpretation of what someone has said. Photographs, it's the same thing. They can be manipulated, but it's a place to start. And I find that the other thing that I really love to use is dissertations. So if someone has done, you know, an advanced degree on a very particular historical Ukrainian subject, their dissertation is usually just golden. And also the bibliography of their dissertation is usually a pretty good source of information.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And your last book is about Holodomor.
Yes.
The most tragic famine for Ukraine and genocide for Ukrainian nation. Yeah. Many families in Ukraine still keep stories about living through those times.
Yes.
When Holodomor happened, my great-grandma was 13, and she used to tell a story that one day a woman from eastern Ukraine came to their village looking for food. Because my family lived in western Ukraine, they didn't suffer from famine. And she brought her little son with her and asked to leave him in my family's house just for a few hours while she was trying to get some food in the village. She picked him up until she didn't pick him up until maybe like a year or more.
Wow.
Yeah, so she knew that she might die, and she knew that she might not be able to take care of her kid during this time. She didn't have means to.
Mm-hmm.
So she decided to just leave him in a family that was better off and not in the state of famine at that time, and picked him up when she was more secure and able to take care of him.
And she lived. That is the amazing thing too, that she lived that year to come back.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's
amazing.
Yeah. Does your family have any story about Holodomor, or maybe any other tragic events you write about?
Not the Holodomor. My grandfather came to Canada before World War I, and he was interned as an enemy alien. And that was actually the inspiration for my first book, Silver Threads. And that was the first commercial book about the internment of Ukrainians. Like, I mean, storybook. There had been academic papers and academic books, but not books geared towards regular readers. So he wasn't in Ukraine during all that upheaval, you know, because he came in World War I. But he did inspire Winterkill in some ways, because a lot of the men who had been interned in World War I, when they got out of the internment camps, even the Ukrainian community turned their backs on those men. And the church did, And so a lot of them ended up becoming communists because the communists opened up soup kitchens for them. So my grandfather, George Forchuk, was actually buried as Comrade Forchuk. And he tried to get back to Ukraine, Soviet Ukraine, because he needed to find his mother and sister. And his mother and sister have inspired other of my books. But his mother was died in the gulags. And the reason that she was sent to the gulags was because in World War II, her daughter, my grandfather's sister, was in the UPA. And so she's buried in a mass grave. Now, this is all just word of mouth. So who knows how much truth there is in this? But that story has inspired me to write other books. For example, Traitors Among Us. What happens to the two girls in this book? It's after World War II. They think they're safe in an American displaced persons camp, and they're kidnapped by Soviets and taken to a silence camp where they're interrogated as, suspected Nazis, of course, which Ukrainians are always, going to be accused of by the Soviets. But that was inspired by them, because like, what was my great aunt doing? She was fighting the two dictators. And so the one that won then killed her. But my grandfather, because he was in Canada and had a different idea about what communism was, he joined the party. And he used that membership to try and get back to his homeland to find the rest of his family. He was not given permission. But in Winterkill, the girl, Alice, comes with her father, whose name is George White, and I basically based him off my grandfather. And I thought of Alice as being myself, that if I had been born at that time and if my grandfather had been able to go back, I could have been the daughter that had been propagandized into believing all this stuff and going at a time and helping with collectivization, because there were a lot of North Americans who did that, There were a lot of Canadians and Americans who joined the Communist Party and, went to the Soviet Union to help Stalin in his collectivization plans. So my grandfather did learn about the famine, and he was just so horrified and shocked. But he didn't give up his party membership. It's just so bizarre. But it's because those were the people that he knew. It was his other internees, and they were a group. And so he kept for them. But, it was a different kind of communism than what was over in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and I feel if we talk to literally any person from any Ukrainian generation, there is always some tragedy in there, because every generation of Ukrainians went through some tragic events.
They did.
And even right now, as we're going through war, does current war bring up any ideas for new books for you? And are you planning to write anything about the current war in Ukraine?
I've already finished a book set in Mariupol about a girl who's kidnapped by the Russians and brainwashed. So Scholastic came to me and asked me to write a trilogy set in the current war. It was a hard ask because honestly, it's so hard to even think. We all hoped that it would be that we would have won by now. And it's just so painful. But the thing is especially right now, because it's like the West, they don't have their 30-minute game show to watch, which is what I think they were thinking the war was, And so the interest is going down, funding is going down, everything is going down. So this book comes out next fall, in the fall of 2024, and it's about the kidnapped kids. And so I hope that it focuses more. And the thing about my books is that I have a different readership than most writers, because my books are sold in the Scholastic book fairs. In the US, that's like, they've got a lot of them in the schools. It's like a pop-up store in the schools. And the kids choose the books themselves, and I'm very popular. And so what it means is that the kids are going to choose a book themselves to read, and it will be about what's happening in the war now. And then they can talk to their parents about it. And then they can talk to their librarians about it, and they can talk to their teachers about it. So I'm hoping that it will raise some awareness in a different way than other writers might be able to do it.
That's a really, really important work to do right now, and thank you so much for doing that. And majority of your books are based on tragic historic events, and I feel like they definitely bring up lots of emotions, even as a reader. So how do you deal with your emotions when you write about such difficult traumatic events, and how do you prepare for writing about such events?
So it's really hard. So sometimes even when I'm writing, I'm weeping, and when I do public reading, even an excerpt, sometimes I just am brought to tears. And I know it's a price that I have to pay, because the people who I'm writing about, I'm just witnessing. They're living it. And so it's all I can do to honor them is to basically write from blood on the page, cutting my own veins and writing with it. Because if I didn't do that, then what would be on the page? It would not be authentic. But it is a really hard thing to do. And I try to give myself a break, which is why I don't read, a lot of the things that I read for pleasure are much lighter than what I write, just to give myself a break. And the same thing when I watch movies or television, I watch light things, comedy, just to give myself a break. And I go on long walks. I have friends who will tolerate these very long walks with me, which is great, because it's something that I really enjoy. But it is hard, but also, we all are given abilities. And I think the reason that I was put on this earth is to write these books for young people, and to not write about a purple dinosaur or something, but to write about serious things that kids need to know about, and also to be respectful of kids' intelligence, because really, of all the people in the world, who's going to save us? It's going to be the kids. So we need to make sure that our young people have a healthy intellectual diet. And so I'm there to provide some of it.
Yeah, that's definitely not easy, but it's very important. And I know that one of your books is already translated to Ukrainian. Do you have any plans to translate any of your other books to Ukrainian?
Well, it's not me having the plans. It's a right. So what happens is a publisher approaches my publisher, and they negotiate, the book coming out in a different language. So the first one that came out is Stolen Child. And this is the Ukrainian edition. And I'm just so thrilled with it. I don't read Ukrainian well enough to have read my own book in Ukrainian, but friends of mine who have read it have told me that it is a brilliant translation. And I just love the cover. This cover is really neat, because this is an apple that's being peeled. And an apple is symbolic in the book, but also the peel is also symbolic, and also the color of lavender, which symbolizes memory. And so it's just really neat. And so the next book that will be published is Making Bombs for Hitler. And that is by far the best-selling book. Here's one. This is the original Canadian edition of it. It's been republished so many different times with so many different covers. But this book is the first time in a commercial novel that an Osterbiter was the main character. And when you think of how many millions of Ukrainians suffered as slave laborers for the Nazis, and that story was never told. And so I'm very proud that this is so popular with kids. I get so many letters from kids. I just had a letter the other day. Here it is. And this boy tells me that I have read Making Bombs for Hitler at least 5 times. And he's a teenager here. And he wrote me a letter to tell me how significant this book was. But, for him, it's significant because it helped him have empathy and get along with his sister better. but he also learned history from it, and he learned Ukrainian history, which I think is so important to know. If you want to understand the world today, you have to understand Ukrainian history. If you don't understand what happened before, you're not going to understand why Putin is doing what he's doing right now.
Yeah, that's probably the most fascinating and amazing thing for an author, to get feedback from your readers. And do you have any rituals before starting to write a book? Like, do you have some personal places of inspiration that help you with the writing process?
So I have to pretend that I'm not doing work. And when I'm writing, I write for 3 hours a day or in 3-hour chunks. So I have to find a place to write where I've tricked my brain into thinking it's not work. So a number of books in a row I wrote on a tread desk. So my husband built a desk on our treadmill, and then only I got to use it, because then you couldn't put it up and down, and it was just a mess all the time, right? And so I'd take my laptop down, I'd unplug it, and the battery was like old, so it would only last for 3 hours, and then it would start beeping at me. But I would write. I wrote 3 or 4 books in a row on that tread desk, 3 hours at a time. So it was great. And then I wrecked my knee because I was walking exactly the same so often, 7 days a week. So I couldn't do that anymore. Then I had a favorite chair. Right now, my husband is very upset because no, I shouldn't say that. He's very good about it. But the place that I'm reading is his reading place. This is where I'm writing, and I've written the last 3 books in his spot. And he's been very good about it. Brings me perfectly boiled eggs and overbrewed tea, and tiptoes out of the room as I'm writing away.
That's such an interesting fact. And the main characters of your books are mostly young people. So do you ever think back to your childhood when you write and use maybe your younger self as a prototype for any of your characters?
So I usually start with me. And I don't have to go back anywhere, because like I am 12 years old inside. So it's just the way that I deal with things. It's still all there. But generally the character tells me who they are. So I start out with someone who has like almost a blank affect. And then as I'm writing it, they fill it in. It's not so much me. It's that the character themselves becomes clearer to me. And I know that that sounds kind of psychotic or something, because like people think of writing as something that the author does to the story, but really there's inspiration that comes like this too. And I think that the writer needs to be open enough to let the story come to them rather than writing the story actively. And that's what will cause writer's block too, is if you've got too much direction. If you're giving the story too much direction, then you'll run the story into the corner. But if you just kind of be open-minded about it and let the story happen where it wants to happen, like you'll be surprised. And then it will take you to places that you didn't think were going to go there. And then, so you go in a place different, and then you have to like research like crazy to catch up with that place, especially when you write historical fiction. So that's what I do. Just as an example, in Traitors Among Us, which is the book that came out right before Winterkill, 1 year before Winterkill, the very first scene, something happened and I didn't plan it at all. And I had my 2 girls, sisters, and they were finally safe in this refugee camp, like an American refugee camp. And who walks in but this Hitler girl, like, she was a Hitler Youth member, as all German girls were, but from the farm where one of the sisters had been. And she walked in and she was using the papers of a Polish girl that one of the sisters knew. I didn't tell her to do that. And she became key to the book. I was really glad that she did that. But if I planned my books better, then she wouldn't have come in, because I had something totally different in mind, but she just walked in and kind of took it over.
And as a person that just has those surges of inspiration and stories coming to you, are you always satisfied with the story at the end? Or do you maybe have some situations when the book is already ready for publishing, or maybe even in the process, and you get some new ideas and want to change something?
That's a really interesting question. And it could happen, except it doesn't happen, because I work with a phenomenal team of editors. And in order to fast forward the process for me, because really my books take me 2 years each, except they come out once a year. So that doesn't add up, right? And so Scholastic has let me use a freelance editor that they provided me with. Her name is Sarah Harvey. And so once I get even a portion of my novel finished, then I send it to her. And then she asks me all these questions that I probably wouldn't have thought of in another year. And so it helps me. And then like we'll have a long phone call. And so it's just this, it jump starts. It's almost like she's my second brain, because she can see what I'm thinking of before I have it completely thought out. And she's not the only one. And then after that, then it goes to New York, and I have another editor there, and she does the same thing. So it fast forwards all these things that I had partly worked out in my head, but it was only really in some ways half baked, because, you know, I would have liked a whole other year to write it. And so it's all my words, but they ask the questions. And then in response to those questions being asked, it means that I can have everything in the book and write it that much faster because of the editorial suggestions that I get.
Yeah, that's definitely helpful. And I know that your path as a writer wasn't always so easy and successful. After writing your first book, you got 100 rejections from publishers.
Yes.
So what is your happiest and most difficult moment in your writing career, and how did you motivate yourself to keep going?
So I think one of the best things that ever happened to me was failing 4th grade and learning how to read so late, because it set me up for the fact that failure isn't a bad thing. And so when you fail, it just means that then you pick yourself up and start over again. But it's not a reflection of you being a bad person or stupid or anything like that. It's just that now you've gone through that step. Now you want to do the next. And so failing early meant that I have tried and I've risked a lot of things that a lot of people would never even dream of trying in the first place. So as I was getting the rejections for that first novel, some of them would send snarky, like cover letters, like really snarky cover letters, but others would give me suggestions. And so I used the suggestions that they had in these cover letters, rejection letters, and it improved the document. And so like the thing is that if you're open to understanding that you're not perfect, then, you know, it really helps an awful lot. But, you know, I did end up doing a lot of revisions on that manuscript, and it did ultimately get published, but it got published as 5 individual books, because like all first-time authors, I put everything plus the kitchen sink into that first manuscript. So my dad said at the time, like he had read that manuscript, and he said, you know, it's pretty good. He says, but if it's published like this, you will never live it down. And he was right. So it was the best thing that could ever happen, was getting rejected. And so like a lot of people who are quite young, and even kids, will come to me, and their parents will come to me, and they'll say, my 9-year-old or my 12-year-old is a brilliant writer. How do I get this book published that they wrote? And my answer is, if your child was really wanting to be a veterinarian when they got older, would you now let them operate on their pet dog? No, because it's still a process, right? So the stakes are not as high in writing, because you're not going to kill a dog. But, you know, you could kill a person's enthusiasm for writing by having a book come out too early, and then having it there and everybody to see it, and having it something that ultimately they're ashamed of. So, you know, failure is one of the best things to happen to anyone.
That's an interesting perspective. But then later, when you got more successful, you also received the Order of Princess Olha from President Yushchenko. What does this order mean for you, and why is it so valuable? So when my picture book Enough came out, and that's 23 years now. This came out in the year 2000, and it's set during the Holodomor. So just think of that, a children's picture book, set during the Holodomor, that long ago. There hadn't been anything like commercially available about the Holodomor at all.
again, there had been academic studies. Mostly at that point, it was self-published work because you couldn't get something on the Holodomor published. I came out with this book. I got death threats, hate mail by pro-Stalinists. The other thing about this book, it's written like a grim fairy tale, and so I make fun of Stalin. It also, in this book, it's a mass grave in a children's picture book. Like, how cheeky is that to do that? But also, the Stalin character just looks like a total doofus. I want to show him to you. He's just an oaf. And so it really angered a lot of people who thought that communism was good and that Stalin was, should be on icons. There's a lot of people like that still, isn't there? And so it just made my life absolutely miserable, because even when I did any kind of public event, I had to call the police, and they would send plainclothes policemen to where I was doing a presentation. Like, pathetic. My son had to cancel his 16th birthday party because I got a threat on that day. So it was just horrible. When Yushchenko was elected president of Ukraine, what a watershed moment for Ukraine. And he publicly spoke about the Holodomor. And so when he came to Canada, he met a lot of people who had done similar things to me, had written about the Holodomor at risk of their lives, really. There's one woman in the States, and we had corresponded, and I won't mention her name, but she actually had a tarantula put in her car. The things that happened, people who would write about Ukrainian history back then. And so to me, it was just huge that I was being recognized for writing about something that was supposed to be hidden. Also, interestingly, because President Yushchenko talked about it so publicly, about the Holodomor, then countries recognized it, and I actually stopped getting the hate directed at me. It stopped up until the current war. But so to me, it's not just an award, it's not an accolade so much as it provided me with safety again.
And does this maybe also make you feel more connected to your Ukrainian lineage? And in general, what helps you feel connected to your Ukrainian lineage as a person that was born in Canada? Do you maybe study your family tree? Do you know the history of your family name?
Well, my family name, Forchuk, is basically a made-up name as far as I know. But my husband, Orest Skrypuch, his parents they were DPs after World War II, and they never told their own kids what they endured as young people, but they did share with me. And so a lot of my books, for example, Stolen Child, Stolen Girl, is published under the two different titles, was inspired by my mother-in-law, because her classmates were taken for the Lebensborn program. Trapped in Hitler's Web is basically based on what happened to my own father-in-law. He actually escaped being killed by the NKVD because he was a university student. He was a medical student, and they were rounding up all the educated Ukrainian students, right, to kill them. And he escaped, by the skin of his teeth. And he went into Nazi Germany and hid in plain sight as basically a slave laborer without the papers. And he'd just go from one farm to the next, and with people not with the proper papers or anything, just in hiding and working. So that, I would say that I married into my Ukrainian heritage in a lot of ways. And my husband is a Ukrainian speaker. It was his first language. But, I wasn't raised with it, but I have to say, I feel very Ukrainian. It is who I am. And I have studied my family so much, my Ukrainian family so much. And also writing the books also helped me reclaim the rest of my cousins and everything, which was kind of neat because my father was married more than once, and his brothers were all married more than once. And the problem with that, when you have like the subsequent sequential marriages, is a lot of the cousins lose track of each other. So when my first book, Silver Threads, came out and it had Forchuk on the title, and I did a book event at Audrey's bookstore in Edmonton, all these people came, and I was thinking, wow, am I ever popular? But it turned out that a lot of them were cousins that I just hadn't connected with before. So it was like this huge family reunion, which was just awesome. All these, you know, Ukrainian cousins that I didn't know before.
And it looks like your Ukrainian heritage is really important for you right now. So do you maybe have any family heirlooms that get passed on from generation to generation?
No, I'm wearing my husband's trousseau. Does that count?
I guess it does. Or maybe now when you're more like a Ukrainian family, when your husband is Ukrainian as well, maybe you will do that with your kids and like their kids. So maybe we can start that tradition.
Right now in my hometown of Brantford, Ontario, at the museum, they have a display for Ukrainians in Brantford. And so I'm proud to say that a good portion of what is on display is my own stuff. So this is embroidery that I collected, eggs that I did myself. I taught myself how to do pysynka because no one taught me. And photographs and everything. So I was their historical helper for putting the thing together, like the Ukrainian expert. So I thought that was pretty cool, not having been raised Ukrainian, to be their historical expert.
That's really amazing. And I know that after graduating university, you also backpacked around Europe. So what's your favorite European country? And would you ever leave there if you had a chance?
Well, my favorite European country is, of course, Ukraine, the center of Europe, the heart of Europe. I don't think that I would ever live any place other than Canada, but like my heart is in Ukraine. I've only visited twice. I'm grateful that I was able to travel all through Crimea before it was ruined. And I visited my grandfather's home village. And so that was really nice too. So, you know, but I've traveled over Europe a lot. I've traveled in various places, and it's always nice to travel and to see how other people live, and it's great to come home too. The problem with living in other places, it would be hard to write. And so being at home, it's in many ways, it's like a blank slate, and it gives you the chance to write better.
Thank you so much for your answers. And I know that you're going to have an event in Toronto on December 10.
Yes.
Can you please tell our audience a bit more about the plan of the event and what books are you going to present?
So I'll be talking primarily about Winterkill, which is my most recent book. And it's set during the Holodomor. But the books that I'm best known for are my two trilogies set during World War II. So there's the Making Bombs for Hitler trilogy and the Don't Tell the Nazis trilogy. So I will be touching on those as well. But I'm going to leave the session primarily open for questions too, because it's been a long time since I've done stuff in person. We all have got so used to Zoom, right? And so it will be really nice to see people face to face. And this will be my first Ukrainian event since alive in person since before the pandemic. But, you know, about half of my 25 books are written about Ukrainian topics. And so there's a lot that I can talk about, but those are the things that I'll probably talk about the most.
Yes, so you mentioned you will mostly be talking about Winterkill. Do you remember the first reviews you got after you published this book, or maybe you remember the most touching review you got?
So the one that thrilled me the most was in the New York Times. It just blew me away to be reviewed in the New York Times. But the thing that was kind of weird when Winterkill came out was that I wonder whether there had been some Russian influence about who even got copies of the book, because the publisher was sending out review copies all over the place, and it seemed that no one was getting them. And so there have been really weird things that have happened. And I am banned by Russia, which I think of as an award. And that happened shortly after Winterkill was published. But there just seems to be a lot of interference going on. And so just as another example, I cannot do a review on Amazon anymore. And it was because I did a review on a book about the current situation in Russia, and Amazon flagged it as controversial, and it wasn't. I just said what the book was about. And then they deleted all of my reviews on Amazon, and I am a reviewer. So like, it's just funny stuff has been going on. And I get reviews on my books, things like calling me a kurkul, telling me to kill myself. And a lot of times those ones I can just either report or delete. So I guess those things have been more memorable to me than the reviews, because it's, I guess I should be happy that I'm getting someone angry, because, you know, I think all writers should get people angry.
I see. And thank you so much for the conversation. It was a pleasure to get to know you better as a person and as an author. I would like to invite everyone one more time to Marsha's event in КУМФ Gallery in Toronto on December 10th. If you enjoy reading and would like to see some literature content and books review from me, please follow me on Instagram at millionstories.bookclub.